Democracy begins with a relatively negative view of human nature. Human beings who are capable of the most admirable expressions of caring, kindness, compassion, and love are also capable of the most selfish acts partaking of aggression, greed, and cruelty. We humans can aspire to the lofty heights that reason bestows on us, but we can also be astoundingly irrational with our reason driven by our passions. In addition, human beings are prone to assert their power for both good and ill. Oftentimes we exercise our power in the service of constructive activities and creative ones. But at other times, people are prone to assert their power over others for the sake of personal aggrandizement or the augmentation of their egos. No doubt we all have these propensities to varying degrees. And whether the altruistic or selfish capabilities are given expression may be shaped by the society and the conditions under which we live. But the fact that we do possess these negative capacities is what makes democracy necessary. There is an often repeated adage that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The founders of the American Republic were profoundly aware of this, and their genius was to create a political arrangement to ensure that if life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were to be preserved, power would have to be divided among various sectors of society and should never become concentrated in the hands of a few. Having left the European continent, where from time immemorial people suffered under the oppression of autocratic monarchs, often sustained in their power by churchmen who claimed that their authority came from God, the founders knew well the evils that emanate from concentrated and unchecked power. A second premise of democracy is that the individuals who make up the human population are incorrigibly diverse in the opinions and values that they hold. We're sort of perversely different from each other. I mean, that's the case. It is in our natures for a variety of reasons to disagree, to bicker, and to hold and pursue different interests from one another. And people really do hold different interests, sincerely do, and different people really do value different things. These differences, therefore, make achieving human agreement on virtually anything a formidable challenge and often a very arduous process. It is out of these realities that democracy is created as the best, or we might say the least bad, form of government, if oppression, violence, and chaos are to be avoided. Or to put a positive spin on it, democracy is the most promising form of government if human beings are to be provided the best chance to live a good life and pursue their individual and collective interests while allowing others to live theirs. We Americans, starting in elementary school, have been brought up to believe that democracy is the best and only acceptable form of government. This fact was taught to me as a child as being virtually self-evident and something that any clear-thinking person would assuredly want for himself or herself. But the historical truth is that democracy has had a long and uneven birth, and for the most of human history, democracy has in fact had a bad name. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato believed that democracy, which the Greeks understood primarily as direct democracy, was essentially ruled by the mob, and the mob is led by impulse and not reason. For Plato, only the most enlightened and those rigorously trained for leadership were capable of ruling. Plato, in fact, was an enlightened autocrat. Throughout Western history, there have been examples of representative governments, but they were not necessarily democratic, if we mean by democracy that rule is ultimately held by the people themselves. There were various forms of aristocracies, oligarchies, parliaments comprised of elites that passed laws on behalf of the people and themselves, and in England limited the power of the monarchy. But it is not until we get to the American experiment that we see the merger of representative government, wherein the representatives are elected by the people, that we have come to know the form of government we come to know as a republic. A republic is a form of democracy in which representatives are elected by the people and in principle express the interests of the people they represent. By the way, it's interesting, when America was founded, the founders debated as to what to call our form of government. There was really confusion. Do we call ourselves a democracy or do we call ourselves a republic? I mean, there really was debate about that, what in effect we should call our mode of government. Needless to say, At its beginning, democratic participation through suffrage was limited to only free adult male citizens who were property owners. Slaves, women, and unproperty people were excluded from voting. Over 2 centuries, the right to suffrage expanded to include those who were historically prohibited from the vote. Tragically today, I would think, we are witnessing a retrenchment from that expanding circle of inclusion, with all kinds of barriers established, from demanding photo IDs to setting up registration restrictions and other ruses reminiscent of the ugly practices such as poll taxes and literacy tests that we associate with the Jim Crow era. It is a retrenchment of democracy that we are witnessing in various distressing ways in our times, and is a major part of my address this morning. But if we take the 2 elements of the human condition just mentioned, such that concentrated power leads ultimately to tyranny, and different people inevitably have competing values, ideas, and interests, we can see our democratic system as an ingenious arrangement to accommodate those realities and create a system best poised to enable the peaceful flourishing of human beings. What the framers did was to create a system whereby people could express their different and competing interests and do so passionately, but in such a way that no one group could hold a monopoly of power over others. In other words, they created, as articulated in our Constitution, as we know, an elaborate separation of powers and a form of checks and balances to offset a concentration of power in one arm of government or in one faction of society. So, we have 3 co-equal branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and judicial, whose functions are tightly interwoven and mutually dependent. Congress passes laws, which the president signs, and the courts assess as constitutional or not. The president nominates senior judges, which the Senate needs to confirm, and so on, with multiple examples. We also have a separation, another form of keeping power apart, a form of separation of church and state, ensuring that religious doctrine cannot be enforced by the power of the state and that religious freedom cannot be violated by the state. The founders were close enough to the European wars of religion to know that when you marry the power of the state with the absolute power emanating from the Word of God, you created extraordinarily explosive and wicked brew. And so they created an ingenious arrangement by which to keep religion and government apart. Unfortunately, we are seeing, as we speak, that separation eroding before our very eyes as religion seeks and finds greater validation and support by the state. It's another expression, I think, of the retrenchment of democracy in our time. And the Republican form of representative government is itself a check on the rule of the mob, so to speak, which again, so it is argued, gives free rein to impulse over reasoned reflection. In other words, a representative form of government makes the implicit assumption that if the will of the people are to be turned into law in the best way, then that process requires reflection, deliberation, debate, and sufficient time to mull things over. A direct democracy wherein all citizens simply cast their vote on every issue and turn it into law, devoid of enough time to reflect on it and debate alternatives, would quickly lead to the trampling on freedom and produce the worst outcomes for all. A question that is raised, I think, in our times, a very serious one, is that with the advent of the internet and social media, is whether we are veering towards that very condition which helps to subvert the filters and checks provided by a representative system of government. I mean, the geniuses in Silicon Valley who created the internet probably thought they were creating something that was an unfettered, and did believe that they were creating something that was an unfettered good at the beginning, because it would give every individual the capacity to immediately converse with billions of other people, thus creating a cornucopia of, new ideas and so on that would enrich everyone concerned in humanity. Well, what's happened over time is a type, in some ways, is an incredible negative that we have to deal with. And that is, rather than with multiple, infinite number of sources of information, rather than elevating discourse, what it seems to do in many cases is silo that information, where people are now, as individual atoms, are free to choose what they are going to believe and reinforce through the information they get, thus narrowing rather than broadening their thinking And as it narrows, it becomes more intense and potentially more extreme. It's a paradox, in effect, and runs against the sort of Republican notion that if indeed policies and political thinking is going to be the most prudent and wisest, you have to have time for deliberation. You have to have time to think about it, and it can't be an impulsive knee-jerk response to anything, you know, being presented on your screen. And there's some, you know, the ambiance is not really, in my view, all that productive for a robust, mature, you know, democracy. Historically speaking, and looking at the world scene, as much as we may feel that democracy is the only acceptable form of government, it's an idea that only recently has taken hold. By some reckoning, there were only 10 democracies in the world in 1900, and that shrunk to 9 in 1942 during the fascist period. After World War II, the number began to rise, so that by 1960 there were 33 democracies in the world. With the fall of the USSR in 1991, 71 nations were counted as democratic, and according to the Pew Research Center, at the end of 2016, 97 out of 167 nations with populations over 500,000, or about 6 out of 10 countries, are democracies. In the long range, that may seem like very good news, okay? But as we all know, in the last several years, there have been very disturbing countertrends. Freedom House, which is a somewhat conservative human rights organization of long standing, surveys every year, surveys democracy and freedom around the world, and issues reports and, you know, charts and tables about which countries are free and which are less free, and so on and so forth. Let me just read, actually considerably, from their latest report, okay? They say, democracy faced its most serious crisis in decades in 2017, as its basic tenets, including guarantees of free and fair elections, the rights of minorities, freedom of the press, and the rule of law, came under attack around the world. 71 countries suffered net declines in political rights and civil liberties, with only 35 registering gains. This marked the 12th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. The United States retreated from its traditional role as both a champion and an exemplar of democracy amid an accelerating decline in American political rights and civil liberties. Political rights and civil liberties around the world deteriorated to their lowest point in more than a decade in 2017, extending a period characterized by emboldened autocrats, beleaguered democracies, and the United States' withdrawal from its leadership role in the global struggle for human freedom. Democracy, they say, is in crisis. The values it embodies, particularly the right to choose leaders in free and fair elections, freedom of the press, and the rule of law, are under assault and in retreat globally. A quarter of a century ago, at the end of the Cold War, it appeared that totalitarianism had been at last vanquished and liberal democracy had won the great ideological battle of the 20th century. Today, it is democracy that finds itself battered and weakened. For the 12th consecutive year, according to Freedom in the World, that's their report, countries that suffered democratic setbacks outnumbered those that registered gains. States that a decade ago seemed like promising success stories, Turkey and Hungary, for example, are sliding into authoritarian rule. The military in Myanmar, which began a limited democratic opening in 2010, executed a shocking campaign of ethnic cleansing in 2017 and rebuffed international criticism of its actions. Meanwhile, the world's most powerful democracies are mired in seemingly intractable problems at home, including social and economic disparities, partisan fragmentation, terrorist attacks, and an influx of refugees that has strained alliances and increased fears of the, quote, the other. Of course, I think that ends that quote. Of course, we can see much of the United States, tragically, in this, and much of the report deals with our own situation. I'll just conclude with a small part that focuses on the U.S. In 2017, America's core institutions were attacked by an administration that rejects established norms of ethical conduct across many fields of activities. President Trump himself has mingled the concerns of his business empire with his role as president, appointed family members to senior staff, filled other high positions with lobbyists and representatives of special interests, and refused to abide by disclosure and transparency practices observed by his predecessors. The president has also lambasted and threatened the media, including sharp jabs at individual journalists, for challenging his routinely false statements, spoken disdainfully of judges who blocked his decisions, and attacked the professional staff of law enforcement and intelligence agencies. He signals contempt for Muslims and Latin American immigrants and singles out some African Americans for vitriolic criticism. He pardoned a sheriff convicted of ignoring federal court orders to halt racially discriminating policies, and issued an executive order restricting the travel to the United States from a group of Muslim-majority countries after making a campaign promise to ban all foreign Muslims from the U.S. And at a time when millions around the world have been forced to flee war, terrorism, and ethnic cleansing, President Trump moved to implement major reductions in the number of legal immigrants and refugees that the United States would accept. The president's behavior stems in part from frustration with the country's democratic checks and balances, including the independent courts, a coeval legislative branch, the free press, and an active civil society. These institutions remain fairly resilient in 2017, but the administration's statements and actions could ultimately leave them weakened, with serious consequences for the health of U.S. democracy and America's role in the world. So ends Freedom House's report. Sorry for the downer. I mean, that is their assessment, but you know, I read the newspaper every day, and it's hard to disagree with this generalized. The reason I mention this is not because it's new, but it's so clearly stated in this report, and I just wanted to lay it out there. Interestingly enough, something referred to as the Economist Intelligence Index, which is related to the Economist magazine, okay, puts out a guide that ranks governments of the world into 4 categories, namely what they call full democracies, flawed democracies, hybrid regimes, that is partial democracies, and then authoritarian regimes. In 2017, for the first time, the United States was ranked in the flawed democracy group. Okay. Not full democracy, we're a flawed democracy based on such qualities as electoral practices, our political culture, civil liberties, political participation, and the general functioning of government. Those are broad sort of the categories. And this is impressionistic. I suspect you get other, summaries that would look rank us differently. But if you're curious, the Economist Index rated as the best functioning democracy in the world, Norway. Okay. In fact, I have it here. I downloaded it. It really is fascinating. It's a whole list of countries, and 10 is a perfect score. Nobody gets a 10. Norway gets a 9.87, and among the best functioning democracies, if you're curious, I found this fascinating, are Iceland. Well, that's only 1/3 of Bergen County, so that's right. Sweden, New Zealand, Denmark, Ireland, Canada. Okay, is among the full democracies. Australia, Finland, Switzerland, Netherlands, Luxembourg. All right, we'll get you Luxembourg. Germany, United Kingdom, they think they're doing better. They are Austria, Mauritius. Okay, Malta, also very tiny. Uruguay is the only Latin country that is a full democracy. Well, Uruguay has a long tradition of democratic government, and Spain, okay? If you're interested, other countries that are with us, that is flawed democracies, are South Korea, Italy. Italy's having a hard time, authoritarian reaction in Italy, right? Japan, I don't know what the problem is with Japan. Cape Verde, Costa Rica, Chile, Portugal, Botswana, we're up there with Botswana. France, Estonia, Israel, Belgium, so on and so forth. And then, of course, they have the failed countries, the authoritarian states, and the world's worst country from the point of view of democratic practice, you guessed it, North Korea. Right, there you go. Right. Anyway, very interesting. I'm fascinated by this stuff. Very interesting. But the point is that the United States, where we wanted democracy, has now not, we're not at the top of the list there. We have lots of problems, okay? Okay. Well, the United States, as mentioned, is part of an ominous backsliding global trend, but because of its unique power in the world, we're still the 800-pound gorilla on the globe. Its history of defending democratic values in the world, at least rhetorically, if not in fact, and because it is my country, it's the one that clearly concerns me the most, as I'm sure it does you. The forces that so threaten American democracy go far wider and deeper, I believe, and have been brewing for far longer than the presidency and the personality of Donald Trump. But it's my contention that we would not see the retreat of democracy, and I think we are, if he had not been elected to the White House in 2016. Movements are fueled by complex underlying forces, but I truly believe, as I read history, that it takes leadership of a particular kind at the right time to light the fuse. Trump as president is the spark that lights the fuse. I mean, one can question, I mean, Hitler arose because of particular economic and political circumstances in Germany after World War I. But had Hitler not become Chancellor of Germany, I'm not sure we would have had a Holocaust. In other words, it takes leadership combined with underlying conditions to create the realities that we confront. And I think Trump is, again, the spark that lights the fuse that allows this type of retrenchment to in such dramatic ways to take place. Well, I've expressed my views about Trump and his unfitness by virtue of temperament, values, and experience to be President of the United States many times. I will just speak briefly again as it leads into my main point. Okay, sorry to you again. I just can't avoid it, and I refuse to. It seems to me that as his term of office extends through time, he's becoming more detached from reality in pursuit of political and personal power. In short, Donald Trump is a demagogue and an autocrat, a small and narrow man who sees holding the presidency as opportunity to augment his power and his wealth and to feed his bottomless malignant narcissism. In this regard, he sees the conventions of the presidency, the essential role of the free press, which he relentlessly attacks, and the constitutional restraints embedded in divided government and our brilliant system of checks and balances as simply obstacles to a single-minded quest for individual aggrandizement. What is perhaps more ominous is that he has been adept at cultivating tens of millions of followers and in a way and with messages that are frighteningly reminiscent of the fascist and totalitarian leaders of the 20th century, which generated the worst episodes of oppression and bloodletting in human history. And what is more frightening still is that he is transformed, and this really is the source of my greatest concern and anger, is that he has transformed and poisoned the entire leadership of the Republican Party, who are his followers and his enablers. We still wait in vain for one of them, just one of them, without equivocation, to stand up and denounce this demagogue for what he is, and do so in the name of our freedom, our Constitution, our country, and human decency, and resign if necessary by making that statement. But not a single one has the courage, in effect, and the principles as, quote, patriots, to do that for the sake of freedom, democracy, and our country. But what we have instead, I think, is a complicity of silence. And the dereliction of leadership throws the future of our democracy, therefore, back on us, the people as a whole. And we are the ultimate repository, right? And we are now confronted as never before with the challenge of being the saviors, okay, of our system, of our freedom and democracy, the people at large. When I say that Trump's behavior is becoming more extreme, I'm referring especially with our midterm elections just 3 days away to his ramped up rhetoric targeted at beleaguered refugees and immigrants who are walking to the American border. This is truly extraordinary. I mean, it is a fantasy. Okay, the images of the barbarians at the gates, okay, he's referred to those coming here out of desperation as an invasion, as if mothers with children in arms were pushing baby strollers are the equivalent of a violent militarized force. He claims that these beleaguered Central Americans have been infiltrated by Middle Eastern terrorists without a shred of evidence. And of course, George Soros, that beleaguered George Soros, is behind it, right? Think of a Jewish cabal. I mean, the layers of racism and hatred and conspiratorial thinking are just extraordinary, okay? He claims that they are carrying diseases even though the vaccination rate, I think, I read this, and I've got to fact check it, but I have read that the vaccination rate in Honduras is higher than that of what it is in the United States, as impoverished as that country is. He has ordered 15,000 American troops to augment the 5,200 already there, and will issue an order to open fire if any of those coming here so much as throws a stone. It is a political stunt. Okay, that's what it is, a political stunt that is a massive squandering of resources, hundreds of millions of dollars to move these troops, and I think it's an assault on the dignity of U.S. armed forces to exploit them for this political purpose. I mean, it's just bizarre. You know, I gotta say this, I was a student of the classics, and the third Roman emperor was Caligula, who appointed his horse as a consul, okay, slaughtered anybody he thought was his enemy, and did give an order to Roman legions en masse to march from Rome to the shores of Normandy with the order to collect seashells. Okay, that's true. It's part of Roman history. This seems to me to be analogous to that type of insanity. I mean, it's absolutely nuts. The image he has painted is one of a dark-skinned, marauding horde at our gates that is poised to take over our country. He has referred to such immigrants as we know as murderers, rapists, and even animals. It is scapegoating at its worst. It is pandering to the unthinking fear and worst underside of his political base. It is based on falsehoods and lies. It is an inversion of American ideals, and it's blatantly racist. And the icing on the cake is that Trump is committed to destroying America's time-honored tradition of giving refuge to those in danger by offering political asylum. And he claims that he can and will unilaterally overturn birthright citizenship, which of course he can't because it's enshrined in our Constitution in the 14th Amendment. These are all delusions appealing to the ignorance, okay, and the fears of his base. This is the President of the United States of America. It's delusional. The pipe bombs that were sent to Trump's critics, and moreover the massacre at the Pittsburgh synagogue, in my view, are, and I've got to share this, these are the conclusions I can't prove it. Everything has to be supposititious and impressionistic at some point, but in my view, they are the inevitable consequences of the political environment that Trump foments. He did not send the bombs, and he didn't pull the trigger. But given that we have lots of men in this society with screws loose, who are saturated in white supremacist and hateful ideologies, and given that we are a nation awash in big guns, these kinds of events, I believe, are virtually inevitable. Okay? Trump's hate-mongering, his cozying up to white nationalists, gives legitimation to these acts of violence, and we shouldn't at all be surprised, friends, we shouldn't be surprised the next time it happens. When it comes to homegrown terrorism, I think we are living in the midst of a perfect storm. Okay? The elements are all there. And again, he gives the legitimation for every hater, right, to come up, to surface, and manifest their hatred. It's perfectly okay. If the President of the United States can call people animals, then in effect, I can, take matters into my own hands. Well, we have an election in 2 or 3 days, on Tuesday. These midterm elections have rallied a great deal of enthusiasm and excitement, and there's a good chance that the Democrats will win the House of Representatives. If that happens, it may just, this is the greatest sign for hope, okay? And ethical culture, let me say this, and I have to give myself a caveat and excuse myself. In the 40-some-odd years I've been president, leader of the Bergen Society, I have never spoken in a partisan vein. We're not permitted to do that from the pulpit, right? That's the Johnson Amendment, which, by the way, Trump wants to rescind, right? It's still in effect. And I have never supported a political candidate from the platform. I've never supported a political party, but I've got to tell you, the current political reality basically transcends that partisanship. If you have one party that no longer stands for the governing principles of democracy in this country, it becomes a type of artificial, contrived tour de force, not to speak in partisan terms and call reality for what it is. And that, in effect, is what we have. So, in effect, I feel compelled to violate, a principle, an important principle I take very seriously, and I've tried scrupulously throughout my career to uphold. But I think realities have so changed that, it becomes an act of denying the truth and an assault on integrity not to call it the way it is. Okay. Anyway, we have this election coming up. Okay. And the Democrats may win the House of Representatives. If that happens, it may begin to put a check on this march towards authoritarianism and madness. And I think that is our strongest basis for hope. Okay? The situation is not hopeless. Let me just say this. And we know this about politics. Who would have thought after electing our first African-American president, we'd be stuck with this, right? The political wins, we should remember, and there's no determinism in this. There's no invisible hand that's going to save us. I don't believe that. But it is true that political wins blow in both directions, okay? And there is not a unilateral course. There are eddies and back curls and so on and so forth within the context of political realities. So the winds that are blowing in one direction, okay, one year, may indeed reverse course and begin. And we have to be open should not be despair. The future is if you're a humanist, the future is an open future. Okay, if you're a Christian fundamentalist, the future is not open. It's a closed future. You know how things are going to end with an apocalypse. Okay, but if you're a humanist, the future is an open future, and the winds that blow in one direction can blow another. And then, therefore, we should never despair. We should always sustain hope that things may indeed and will change. Okay, if indeed the Democrats can take the House, it may put a check on this march to authoritarianism and madness, and that's our strongest basis for hope. If the election goes, I should say, in the opposite direction, okay, I shudder to think, okay, of the consequences. That will be very bad, I believe, indeed. But here's my point. Damage is being done to our democracy on two levels. There is the manifest level of policies and laws. A House of Representatives, which is not totally subordinate to the influences of Donald Trump, may be able to check bad legislation and promote more progressive laws. It may even be able, out of pragmatic consideration, I think, to woo some senators from the other party into cooperative relationships. And it may further open up political space on the ground, which will effectuate positive changes in our political culture. You know, these things could run afoul. People, the American public at large, including some of Trump's camp followers, may reach the point where they simply have had enough, where they've become disgusted with the tribalism and the small-mindedness, and so on and so forth, and are looking for something different. You know what I'm saying? It could indeed burn itself out. That has happened. You know, I think my analysis is that we elected a peanut farmer from Georgia, right, as president, Jimmy Carter, really on the wake of the Watergate situation. In other words, the federal government presidency had become so corrupt. I think Carter, who is a moral man, and I think he is, and was recognized as such, was elected because people wanted a change, do you know what I'm saying, from the corruption which Nixon had brought. It is possible that enough Americans will simply, it will run its course, they will simply become so fed up with this extremism and mindlessness and demagoguery that they will yearn for what in effect is more sober, rational discourse, and the political winds will turn. That is not impossible, and we've got to hope for it, and we've got to work for it. Okay.
Good point.
But there's a second level. There's the level of policy and law, but this is really where my talk is moving. There's a second level that shapes our political environment that lies deeper than our laws and political policies, and that is the level of norms and values that, when we think about it, ultimately give rise to our laws and policy. Law most often reflects and makes concrete changes in customs and values that first take place earlier on the ground. The reason we have civil rights laws is because we had a civil rights movement that shifted the thinking and values of large sectors of the American public on race issues. Once these laws became enacted and enforced, they then in turn reinforced those values that gave birth to them. In other words, the process is reciprocal and dialectical, so to speak. Okay, but where do laws come from? They don't instantaneously fall out of the heads of political thinkers. They bubble up from concrete changes on the ground of values that are then codified into law. So there's a deeper level of custom, value, and so forth that lies beneath the surface of legislation. There are also underlying norms and values as well as habits that need to be practiced to ensure that our democracy is healthy and freedom endures. Here I fear that the damage done by this administration does indeed run very deep. And even if Donald Trump departs from the scene tomorrow, the damage done, I think, will take a long time to repair. Not impossible, but difficult. There are certain values on which democracy is based, and which the people at large need to accept and internalize as their own if democracy is to endure. Democracy is not self-executing. Democracy is as democracy does. And again, it requires certain habits based on particular values. Democracy, as I understand it, is a process. It's a process not like war, in which you have two opposing sides confronting each other in a zero-sum game. One side wins and the other side loses. Rather, democracy requires that all people engaged in the process entertain an outlook that goes beyond their individual and self-interest, goes beyond it to embrace an appreciation of the welfare of the whole. It entails processes of mediation and a sense of reciprocity. And democracy requires a powerful, powerful commitment to compromise. It is not a process of winner take all, but embedded in the democratic process needs to be an understanding that I or my faction may end up with much of what we want, but not everything that we want. And that reality is acceptable because democracy is an ongoing and fluid process. I may lose what I want today, but I may gain what I want tomorrow. And in the democratic process, citizens, this is very important, have adversaries, but they do not have enemies. Okay, that's an important difference. The last observation points to values that reside even deeper and lie at the very bedrock, I think, of democratic process. And that is the realization that however strongly I may differ with the views of my adversary, they still have a legitimate right to be here and to express their views. In the final analysis, the legitimacy of the other cannot be nullified, but needs to be respected and upheld. Without this fundamental respect, democracy cannot be sustained, and democracy erodes and opens the door to authoritarianism. Democracy, in the final analysis, requires that its citizens be able to see society and everyone in it as an organic, interlocking whole. We're all in it together. We're at the same party, even as we disagree. Okay. But even deeper, at the deepest level, democracy requires the recognition of the humanity of the other. However I despise the views of the other, however threatened I may feel by them, they remain human beings. Martin Luther King, I think it was in a letter to the Birmingham jail, from the Birmingham jail, in describing the felt status of African Americans as non-persons during the Jim Crow era, invoked the phrase, quote, the generating sense of nobodiness. That's how the American Negro felt in the South during the Jim Crow era, the generating sense of nobodiness. It is my apprehension that in this political climate, we are seeing imposed on minorities, on immigrants, on refugees, and on women, the imposition of nobodiness. In other words, we are witness to the dehumanization of human beings, which in concrete terms is leading to the constriction, a limitation of their rights. We see it when the man who holds the most powerful megaphone in the land spews hate, when he describes people with brown skins wholesale as murderers and rapists, and when he refers to human beings as animals, even if they are indeed members of violent gangs. The President of the United, think about it, reflect on it, the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, calling people animals, I think is not only very ugly, it's very dangerous, okay? And I've got to tell you the truth here. This leads to very painful associations. I cannot dispel from my mind that the Nazis first had to convince the German people the Jews were vermin, so-called Untermenschen, subhumans, okay, that is less than human, before they could be exterminated. It's very hard to kill a human being. You first have to convince the potential killer that the object of your killing is not quite human, okay? The Hutus refer to the Tutsis as cockroaches. During the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese were not Vietnamese, they were gooks, as you recall. In other words, you first have to dehumanize. Dehumanization is a necessary step, okay, to annihilation. That I can't get. And when the President of the United States refers to human beings as animals, the optics, as they say, are very bad. Okay, this is the most powerful man in the world doing this. Okay, let me be clear. I am not saying that America is poised for genocide. The conditions certainly are not right for that. But what I think is unfolding is a process of dehumanization as a pretext for restricting and removing the rights of certain classes of people. We are moving backwards in this regard. Okay? Once classes of people gain rights, it becomes very difficult to take them away. And the history of the post-war period is a very good one. We've expanded the circle of rights, right, to lesbians and gays, more so to women, to African Americans, to the disabled. This has been a very good movement, a very positive. It's part of the human rights movement that I'm involved in internationally, a very good thing. But what we're seeing now is a beginning of that circle beginning to get smaller. Again, that doesn't happen very easily. It doesn't happen very readily. Yes, we did take temporarily the rights away from Japanese during World War II. There are examples of that. But what we're seeing now is, I think, a massive broadside assault on the rights of large classes of people. Okay, I have few doubts that Trump would be happy to take away the right, for example, of political asylum, even though the process of providing asylum to those fleeing persecution has been in place since World War II, and the pedigree for asylum goes back as far as the Hebrew Bible, okay? We built up after World War II, when people were in displacement camps in Europe after World War II, the international community built this beautiful architecture that allows for people to petition, not necessarily receive, but ask for political asylum. That human rights architecture, which is encoded in international treaties, which we are signed on to, and which is part of federal law, is actually a fairly fragile structure. Okay, and what we're seeing now is the dismantling of that, the violation of that structure. It's very upsetting. We are bound, as I said, by federal law to do that, but but Trump is happy to sidestep and violate those laws. We know well that he has limited immigration to Muslims from selective countries and makes excoriating and demonizing immigrants the centerpiece of his political rhetoric. We see it in efforts at voter suppression, okay, very disturbing, targeted primarily at African Americans. And I would contend, and people could fair-mindedly disagree, but I contend that his attack on abortion, okay, is an attack on women and women's freedom, okay, and equality across the board. It's an expression of misogyny that pervades and poisons the political environment, much to the pleasure of his religious reactionary followers and others. You know, he's got a lot of support among these evangelicals who are very upset about, you know, they see the world from the point of view of a hierarchy. God the Father at top, the male head of the household, and the wife underneath the male head of the household. So women getting out from the home and working in equality with men is very upsetting to their notion of the cosmic order. And they'd be very happy to see that sort of hierarchy reestablished. And Trump, I think, plays into that sensibility. And removing control over one's body, if you're a woman, is a step towards that misogyny. You know, there was an article in the Times the other day, 2 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, it's on the front page, about the emergence and flourishing, I don't know if you saw this, of women's dystopian science fiction. It was a very interesting, they put it right on the front page, an unusual story to appear there. It's more of a cultural trend, but you have a lot of women science fiction writers who are now writing these dystopian novels about the future, and they deal with, like The Handmaid's Tale, you know, of women turned into really machines or property or whatever, and it's a reflection of the times, of real fears about the status of women, and, you know what I'm saying, and what is happening. It's really misogyny writ large, and this is the cultural environment that is being generated in great measure by our friend in the White House. In closing, let me bring this home, okay, and this is really the good news. Let me bring this home in briefest terms. I think that the values that are needed to animate and sustain democracy, I proudly state, are the values that lie right here at the heart of ethical culture, okay, and I mean that. Okay, as small as we are small, we are a microcosm in the values we hold and how we organize ourselves and in our relation to the world of what democracy is all about. We have taken those values, such as respect for the dignity of others, the need to tolerate difference and dissent, the importance of cooperation and compromise, the importance of reasoned dialogue, and the need to be actively engaged in the outer world and to uphold an appreciation of both individual rights and the common good. And we have made these the centerpiece of our institutional practice. And at best, we have internalized these values and made them guiding elements in how we individually live our lives. Okay? Democracy is about voting. And I have no doubt this Tuesday will be about voting. But I think democracy is really much more than that. If we read our own Felix Adler and the thought of John Dewey, who was close to our movement and America's foremost theoretician of democracy, we can learn that democracy at bottom is the lifestyle, is really the lifestyle of a free people. That's what, I think that phrase comes from John Dewey, that democracy is the lifestyle of a free people. If we continue to live out that lifestyle and remain true to our values, we can be, I think, a necessary example to others, as well as ourselves, of what needs to be done. In these dark times, we have much to do and much to offer. Let us, I therefore say, be confident and resolute in our commitments. And by so doing, we will do our share to preserve and promote the values that sustain a vibrant democracy, which is so imperiled at this moment. At the same time, ethical culture will be a beacon of light to all who know us, and even beyond. Thank you.